MMT and my reaction to Stephanie Kelton's interview on macro voices. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, the basics of MMT. What they believe is that the government and the Fed is the issuer of the currency. They're not the currency user, and there's a big difference. This allows them to spend as much money as they want. Secondly, they believe that bonds, more specifically treasuries, are only issued just as a way to control the amount of reserves, bank reserves in the system, and control short-term interest rates. Third, they believe the only constraint on the amount of money the government or the Fed can print is inflation. And if we do get inflation, it's a very simple fix. All you do is increase taxes and it's problem solved. And we're going to be going over all this throughout the video. And by step number 3, you'll be able to put all of the MMT pieces of the puzzle together to understand how this will affect you, your family, and your finances in the future. But what actually happened with the interview with Stephanie Kelton? Editor, let's go right to a clip so we can check it out. Whoa, time out. Unfortunately, we can't cut to the interview because Stephanie really didn't answer any of the questions. It kind of went something like this. Eric would come in and say, Stephanie, how is money created? And this was her answer.
Now I feel like it's, oh, nice hit.
Stephanie, do deficits actually matter?
Oh, nice hit.
Stephanie, how would we solve the problem of inflation?
Oh, nice hit.
And I know I'm being a little hard on Stephanie Kelton, kind of poking some fun at her. And I want to be very clear. I've got a ton of respect for her. She is actually incredibly intelligent. And I've read some of her papers, one of which we'll get into in step number 2. Incredibly fascinating. But I think she could be angling for some sort of political position in the future. So she really couldn't answer the question. She kind of had to squirm out of them because she didn't want something she said today to jeopardize her getting in a certain position of power in the future. We didn't get much from the interview, so let's review MMT right now so we can get a lot of value here, because I totally agree with Eric in that whether you like MMT or you don't, it's gonna be here in the future. So it starts with this guy who is always giving me a hard time on Twitter and in the comments of my video. He is the MMT troll guy. And he's got his bag of Cheetos right here and his t-shirt that says OnlyFans. I'm not quite sure what that is about, but he is always saying, you Austrian tards, don't you realize we're not on the gold standard anymore? You people are just too stupid. You're rubes, you're simpletons. You don't understand that the government can print all the money it needs. We're not constrained by anything other than our own imaginations. We can have the Green New Deal. All we have to do is leverage the power of our sovereign currency, the United States dollar. Okay, well, let's see how that would actually work. Can the government print limitless amounts of money? The answer is yes. Your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam is right here, and he wants to spend a ton of money into the economy. He wants to make it rain. So the government issues treasuries. That goes through the primary dealer banks. They have this shell game. But theoretically, the Fed could buy all of those treasuries. So the way it would work on the 2 balance sheets, the balance sheet of the Fed and the government, is your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam would issue the treasuries. So those are liabilities on the government's balance sheet. The Fed buys them, so they're assets on the Fed's balance sheet. And to pay for these treasuries, the Fed just prints up funny money or bank reserves. So the bank reserves become an asset of the government, and this is what they can turn into spending in the real economy by creating additional deposits or liabilities of the commercial banking system. We'll get into that more in step number 2. So just to recap, the government sells the Fed the treasuries, the Fed credits the government's account that's held at the Fed, so their balance sheet grows and grows and grows. The government's balance sheet grows and grows and grows. And technically, this process is infinite because there's nothing that would stop them from just adding more and more electronic digits to each other's accounts. To hear Stephanie Kelton explain this in her own words, let's cut to a clip of a CNBC interview where she actually was willing to answer a few questions.
The only potential risk with the national debt increasing over time is inflation. And to the extent that you don't believe the U.S. has a long-term inflation problem, you shouldn't believe that the U.S. is facing a long-term debt problem.
An unconventional economic theory is gaining some traction thanks to the policy teams of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders.
I think the first thing that we need to do is break the mistaken idea that taxes pay for 100% of government expenditure.
My critics say, Bernie, that's a great idea. You're into all this free stuff. How are you gonna pay for it?
So MMT starts with a simple observation, and that is that the US dollar is a simple public monopoly. In other words, the United States currency comes from the United States government. It can't come from anywhere else. So what that means is that the federal government is nothing like a household. In order for households or private businesses to be able to spend, they've got to come up with the money, right? And the federal government, it can never run out of money. It cannot face a solvency problem, bills coming due that it can't afford to pay. It never has to worry about finding the money in order to be able to spend.
So yes, the government and the Fed can print as much money as they want, but is this really revolutionary? The MMT troll guy and all of his cronies would have you believe that they had this epiphany moment, that they have evolved mentally and intellectually so far that they can just see things that us rubes in the real economy and us Austrian tards just don't get. But I think the only people that didn't realize the government can print limitless amounts of money are the MMT guys before they discovered MMT. We've known this for years, guys. Newsflash. The governments can print as much money or as much currency, as much fiat currency as they want. Look at what happened in Weimar Germany. Look at Zimbabwe. That's obviously a result of a sovereign being able to print as much money as they want. There's no constraints on the amount of money. Everybody knows that. There's nothing new, there's nothing novel, there's nothing revolutionary about that statement at all. Step number 2, MMT details. And when you get into the details, this is where MMT starts to derail. And we'll get into that in just a moment. And I know all you MMT troll guys are saying to yourself, oh, that George, he just has a very simplistic view of this. He really doesn't get it. Okay, fair enough. After step number 1, that was the basics. But I would challenge you watching this video, stay till the end, step number 3, and especially this step number 2, and then ask yourself how good my understanding of MMT actually is. Let's dive right in. So we talked about how the MMT folks believe, and rightfully so, and pretty much everyone on the planet Earth that's above 10 years old understands that the government can print as much money as they want. That's not really debatable. It's only debatable in the minds of the MMT troll guys. Number 2 was they believe bonds really aren't necessary for deficit spending. The only reason the government issues them is to manage the amount of reserves in the system, the amount of bank reserves. So there's no need for taxes and bonds to spend. And the only reason you would need a bond to deficit spend, that means spending above and beyond how much you're collecting in taxes, is to manage short-term interest rates through bank reserves. And they say this is proven by accounting. And this is where I actually agree with them wholeheartedly. In fact, I'll give them a lot of credit. The MMT people like Mosler and Kelton know way, way, way more about the accounting of the Fed and the commercial banking system and the Treasury than most economists. So how do bonds, or treasuries more specifically, increase or decrease the amount of bank reserves in the system. If taxes are paid or bonds are issued, that is pulling bank reserves from the system into the Treasury, the TGA. And we'll go over that in this diagram momentarily. If money is spent by the government into the real economy, that is increasing the amount of bank reserves. It's also increasing the amount of deposits or liabilities for the commercial banking system. So if all the government is doing is spending, and they're not taking in any money in the form of newly issued bonds, you're going to have excess bank reserves, and that's going to drop the interest rate all the way down to zero, and the Fed would have a hard time managing it. And I know there's IOER and IOR now, but we're going to get into that in just a moment. Let's not get too far ahead of the game. This is what they believed prior to 2008, just to clarify. So how this works, we have the Fed, government, and primary dealer bank, or bank A, B, and C. This is the Fed's balance sheet. The assets, treasuries, like we went over in step number 1. Liabilities would be the bank reserves. This time I've got the liabilities broken down into each account represented on the right. So the account for primary dealer bank A, the account for bank B, and the account for bank C, and the account of the government called the TGA, the Treasury General Account. These are all accounts held at the Fed, and therefore anything in their accounts are liabilities of the Federal Reserve, just like anything in the deposit accounts with the commercial banking system is a liability of the commercial banks themselves, like your deposits that you have at B of A or Wells Fargo. These banks have deposit accounts in the government. With the Fed, it's the exact same thing. So to keep things simple, let's say in this account there's $2, $3, $0, and $5. So there would be $10 total on the Fed's balance sheet as far as the liabilities. The asset side would balance out, so they would have $10 in treasuries to match up with the $10 in bank reserves, deposits held by the government and the commercial banking system. If we look at the assets of the banks, they're going to have the same $5 that they have over here, because this TGA isn't included in the commercial banking system. At the end, it gets a little complex there, but we're going to kind of go over this from a 30,000-foot view. Technically, the Treasury does have some accounts with the commercial banking system, but those dump into the TGA. So for this video, we'll specifically focus on the TGA. So just to recap, to make sure we're all on the same page, the liabilities for the Fed, the bank reserves that are in the accounts of the banks equal $5. Therefore, the assets the banks have held at the Fed, the same bank reserves, they're a liability of the Fed, but an asset of the commercial banking system, would also equal the same $5. And of course, the deposits held by everyday people just like you and I, such as the average Joe, your friend and family member Fred, and everybody's favorite, Moody the millennial, that would equal the same $5. The assets would match the liabilities. To explore this further, let's go right to the internet and check out a 1998 paper from Stephanie Kelton, and also hear from some of her peers in the MMT community. Thus, an intuitive analysis of Treasury operations suggests a practical motivation for the coordination of taxation and bond sales with government spending, specifically because of the reserve effects of taxation, spending, and selling bonds. The government chooses to coordinate these operations in order to mitigate the impact on the bank's reserve positions and hence on short-term interest rates. Bonds, which are used to prevent deficit spending from flooding the system with excess reserves, allow the maintenance of positive overnight lending rates. Neither taxes nor bond sales, therefore, need to be viewed as a financing operation. In other words, the government doesn't have to issue bonds or tax individuals to spend money. The only reason they issue bonds to deficit spend, that is spending over the amount they're collecting in taxes, is to manage bank reserves and short-term interest rates. And just to be clear, those are Kelton's views, not mine. And like I said earlier, Stephanie Kelton's peers agree. The Mitchell Ray Watts MMT textbook argues that the purpose of these bond issuances by the government issuing treasuries, is to prevent interest rates in the private economy from falling too low. Now let's think this through. What happens if all these taxpayers owe everything they have in their bank to the government to pay for their income tax? Well, the $5 that are represented in the bank reserve accounts with bank A, B, and C would all go into the TGA because Joe, Fred, and Moody have to pay 100% of what they have in their bank accounts to the Treasury. So these $5 would go right into the Treasury's account. These bank reserves would go from here right down to the TGA. So the net effect would be the balance in account A, B, and C would be 0. And the new balance in the Treasury's account would be $10. You'll notice the size of the Fed's balance sheet did not change. It's still $10. The only thing that happened was the digits, the electronic digits in each account just changed. The Fed deleted these or turned them to 0 and turned this account number into a 10. That's the only thing that happened. Then on the bank's balance sheet, how that would change is they now would have 0 assets because all their bank reserves went into the account of the treasuries. But at the same token, they would have no liabilities at all either because all 3 of these individuals in the real economy gave all of their deposit money to the TGA. And since in this very simple example I gave that takes it to an extreme, the deposits in the commercial banking system would be 0. This is why Kelton comes in and says that money has been destroyed. When you pay your taxes or you buy a bond, she believes, and rightfully so, that money in the real economy, in the commercial banking system, deposits, if you will, have gone to 0. Therefore, they don't exist anymore. Money has been destroyed. But let's not forget what happens to short-term interest rates during this process. The Fed funds rate, or the rate of interest banks charge each other to lend or borrow overnight. The more reserves in the banking system there are, the lower the rate should be. It's just simple supply and demand. And if we went to a situation like we explained here, the extreme, where there were 0 or almost 0 bank reserves in the system, then the interest rate would do what? It would go way up. It would skyrocket. So the fewer reserves in the system, the higher the interest rate. The more reserves in the system, the lower the short-term interest rate goes. What Kelton's pointing out is that when people pay the government, whether it's through taxes or bonds, the amount of reserves in the system go down, therefore it increases the interest rate. It manipulates, it makes it fluctuate. Or when the government spends the money, that means more bank reserves go from the TGA into the reserve accounts with the banks, and therefore it increases the amount of reserves and lowers the interest rate. A simple way of looking at this is if taxes are paid or treasuries are purchased by the average Joe or the people in the public, it decreases the amount of bank reserves, increases the short-term interest rates, theoretically. If the government spends money, then it's increasing the amount of bank reserves and lowering the interest rate because of that supply-demand dynamic. And we can see this playing out with the Fed, quantitative tightening, quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is when they're trying to bring interest rates down, therefore they're creating more bank reserves. Quantitative tightening is when they want to let interest rates rise, Therefore, they're selling those treasuries back into the market. They're taking that money out of the system or those bank reserves, and therefore allowing the interest rates to gradually increase. And I know that got a little complex, so at the risk of being redundant, I'm going to review it very quickly one more time just to make sure we're all on the same page. Fed, government, the banks under the Fed's umbrella. This is the Fed's balance sheet. This is the bank's balance sheet. We have the treasuries, which are assets. We have the liabilities, which are the deposits, the bank reserves deposited at the Fed with the banking system and the government. The government's bank account is called the TGA. In this case, we have simple $10 in the system, or $10 of bank reserves. $2, $3, $0, $5. So the $5 in bank reserves that are a liability of the Fed are going to be assets of the commercial banking system to back up their liabilities, which would be $5 of customer deposits from Joe, Fred, and Moody. What happens if all these individuals buy bonds, treasuries directly from the government, or they pay their taxes with 100% of their money? Those bank reserves that are assets of the commercial banking system or liabilities of the Fed would go from their accounts into the TGA. So the new balances for each account would be 0 for Bank A, 0 for Bank B, 0 for Bank C, and all $10 would be in the Treasury General Account. So it would lower the amount of bank reserves in the system, which would create more demand for bank reserves. Therefore, the interest rates, short term, would go up. And when the TGA or the Treasury spends the $10 back into the economy, the whole process works in reverse order. The Treasury sends those checks out to Joe, Fred, and Moody for all $10. They deposit them into their bank account. So now the commercial banking system has liabilities of all $10. And to make sure that they have the assets, the Fed would have to transfer the $10 of bank reserves from the TGA into the accounts of Bank A, B, and C. So now there would be $10 worth of deposits in the real economy, and there would be $10 of assets on the commercial bank's balance sheet, because those would be the bank reserves that are liabilities of the Fed that the Fed transferred from the TGA into the accounts of the commercial banking system. So does the government need to issue treasuries in order to deficit spend? Or are these just tools to micromanage bank reserves and interest rates? The one thing I will say is that if you look at a chart of the TGA back in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 2000s, and you can look at a Fred chart all you want, and you can see the actual balance that was in the TGA, and it never went negative. In fact, when I was looking at it, I couldn't find any point where it went under $3 billion. So how do you prove that the government doesn't need to issue bonds or tax individuals before they spend when the Treasury's own bank account has never been below $3 billion? It's an interesting question that MMTers really can't answer, but the burden of proof needs to be on their shoulders if we've never seen the account go negative in the past. So those are the details of how Treasury sales and purchases affect bank reserves, along with the payment of taxes and government spending. But now we get to the point where MMT really starts to derail. First, let's assume for a moment that the government actually started spending without selling bonds. They were deficit spending, meaning spending above and beyond what they collect in taxes, not by selling treasuries, but just spending the money into existence. Well, if we think this through, that would mean the TGA would go negative. They would have a negative account balance because they didn't bring in enough money to compensate for what they were spending. But if the Treasury's account held at the Fed goes negative for a significant amount of time and by a substantial amount, it means the Fed would be technically insolvent. They have negative equity. Let's think this through. So we start with the Fed's balance sheet having $10 of liabilities and $10 of assets. But let's just take it to an extreme so we can get our heads around it and say that your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam really wants to go on a spending spree. He wants to do the Green New Deal, but he doesn't want to issue any of those pesky bonds that really don't matter because he doesn't want to pay any interest. So he's just going to spend the money into existence, and he's going to spend $100 trillion. In order to do that, the Fed or the government, if they were combined, would have to issue more bank reserves, $100 trillion in bank reserves. Now you may be asking yourself, why would they have to do that? Because they're taking $100 trillion and spending it into the economy by giving checks to Joe, Fred, and Moody, which they deposit at their local bank. Those deposits are a liability of the commercial banking system. Therefore, if the equivalent amount of bank reserves weren't created and given to these banks in their reserve accounts that they have with the Fed, they would also be insolvent. They would have negative equity. Let's go over this one more time so we're all on the same page. Your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam spends $100 trillion into the real economy. The individuals get the checks and deposit them into their accounts. That means the commercial banking system has $100 trillion in liabilities, but they only have $10 in assets. So they would be insolvent. They would be bust. They'd have negative equity. What would have to happen is $100 trillion worth of bank reserves would have to be created and deposited into the accounts of the commercial banks. Therefore, they'd have $100 trillion in new assets to match the $100 trillion in new liabilities. But the Fed themselves don't have any more assets. They started with $10 in treasuries. The Fed would now have $100 trillion in liabilities because of the bank reserves that they had to create, but they'd still only have $10 worth of treasuries or assets. So they would be completely insolvent. They'd have negative equity. Of course, a lot of people are going to say, well, that doesn't matter because the Fed's balance sheet, it's really not like a corporation. They can't go bust because they can continue to print as many bank reserves as they want. And I don't even know how that would work with the Federal Reserve Act, but we'll assume they could. We'll assume it's legal, but it presents another big problem. Say they now have $100 trillion worth of bank reserves, but only $10 worth of assets. How does the Fed reduce the amount of bank reserves in the system? Before, how they would reduce the amount of reserves in the system was through quantitative tightening. The Fed would take the treasuries and sell them back into the private sector. The banking system usually would buy those treasuries, then the Fed would debit their account. They would debit the bank reserves. Therefore, it's an asset swap. The banks would trade bank reserves for the treasuries. The Fed was selling them. So let's walk through this quickly. Say the Fed is selling $10 worth of treasuries to primary dealer bank A. Those treasuries would go onto the balance sheet of primary dealer bank A as an asset, and the Fed would debit their reserve account the $10. If the Fed came in and just debited their reserve account the $10 without selling them treasuries, another asset, that would again make the banking system go bust. They would be insolvent. They would have negative equity because they would have all of these deposits, but the Fed would be deleting their bank reserves or reducing their bank reserves without replacing it with another asset. So just to reiterate here, when the Fed is reducing its balance sheet or when they're reducing the amount of bank reserves in the system, they have to sell the equivalent treasuries or assets to the commercial banking system to debit the bank reserves in the first place. If they don't, the commercial banking system's assets are going to decrease while they still have the same amount of liabilities. And then there's the repo market. I don't even want to go down that rabbit hole in this video, but you guys know very well that the repo market is the key. It's crucial to the plumbing of the financial system. And what does the repo market need to function? It needs pristine collateral. In other words, it needs treasuries. If you don't have enough treasuries in the system, the entire house of cards comes crashing down. So when the MMTers say we don't need bonds or we don't need treasuries, in my opinion, they haven't really thought this through very well at all. And we haven't even talked about the euro dollar market. But again, like repo, that's a completely separate video. The next part of their argument that I think really starts to fall apart is an error of omission. Let's remember, the US government has $27 trillion in debt. That means that we've spent $27 trillion more than we have collected in taxes. If we never would have issued bonds to the private sector, that gap would have had to have been filled one of two ways. Number one, by selling them directly to the Federal Reserve, monetizing the debt, which they did with a portion of that. But the other portion would have had to come through the collection of additional taxes. And not just with the rich. We're talking about the taxes would have had to gone way higher on the poor and the middle class. And we'll get more into this in step number 3. So what the MMTers don't tell you is when the government sells treasuries directly into the private sector, they're basically recirculating money. MMTers wouldn't call it that. They would say that they're pulling money out of the system, destroying it, and they're creating new money by spending it back into the system. But the net effect is identical. You're pulling $100 out and you're putting $100 right back in, but you don't have any additional money supply and you haven't increased the tax burden on Joe Public. The only way around this is to create more inflation, more money supply, or like I said, raise taxes. And the third part of the MMT argument that bonds are required solely to manage bank reserves really derails when we go post-2008. In my opinion, modern monetary theory is no longer modern at all. In fact, it's OMT, which I would call old monetary theory. And the reason I say that is because prior to 2008, yes, treasuries and taxes did matter in the grand scheme of things with the amount of bank reserves in the system. But now it's a complete moot issue because we've done QE1, QE2, QE3, QE4, which is not QE. Whatever you do, don't call it quantitative easing. And then we follow that up with QE infinity. So what's happening is the system is flushed with bank reserves because that's what QE is. It's the Fed creating additional bank reserves to buy assets from the banks under the Fed's umbrella. So we have so many bank reserves in the system now, we need IOR, which is interest on reserves. That means the Fed pays the banks to keep their bank reserves on the Fed's balance sheet. They have to take it up to, call it 50 basis points, 100 basis points, or whatever it is at the time. That's what sets the floor on the Fed funds rate. So the MMTers' hypothesis is treasuries were only issued to micromanage bank reserves and short-term interest rates is totally antiquated. But let's think this through even further. If the Treasury or the TGA doesn't need money in the account to spend, so they don't need to collect taxes, they don't need to sell treasuries to spend money because they're the currency issuer, they spend it into existence, then why have they had to issue bonds since 2008? In terms of the amount of bank reserves in the system or the interest rate, it doesn't make a difference at all. In fact, it's counterproductive because if you look at what the sale of bonds is actually doing, it's taking bank reserves out of the system and putting it into the Treasury general account, like we said earlier. But that's the opposite of quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is when you're putting more bank reserves into the system. So by the Treasury issuing these new bonds, they're taking money out of the system. In other words, while the Fed is doing quantitative easing, the government is doing quantitative tightening, the opposite. And one of Kelton's main ideas is the Treasury and the Fed work in harmony with one another to manage or micromanage the short-term interest rate. And now the Treasury and the Fed are at complete odds with one another. So if we look at all the components we've discussed in step number 2, it becomes blatantly obvious there's a lot of shortcomings in the MMT argument regarding treasuries and how they're exclusively used to micromanage bank reserves, especially in today's day and age of QE infinity. Their whole argument pretty much goes right out the window. Step number 3, the MMT endgame. We learned in step number 1, there really isn't anything radical or revolutionary or outside the box about MMT's belief the government can print as much money as it wants. No one's debating that. Everyone understands that above the age of 10 years old. So I hate to break it to you, MMT troll guy, but you're not that smart. There really is no insight to your theory when it comes to the government being able to print limitless currency units. We all get it. In step number 2, we learned the sale of newly issued treasuries along with taxation and government spending can affect the amount of bank reserves in the system. And prior to 2008, this could have affected short-term interest rates. But does that mean the government doesn't have to sell any treasuries in order to fund deficit spending? Does the TGA not have to have a positive balance? Can it have a negative balance and the Treasury continue to spend money into the real economy? This is their assertion, but there's absolutely no way to prove it because we go back and look at the balance in the TGA and it's never been below $3 billion. So the burden of proof is definitely on the MMT troll guy. Also, their view that the issuance of new treasuries being sold into the market somehow affects the short-term interest rates, Fed funds, is completely obsolete now that we live in a day and age of quantitative easing infinity. And the rebuttal might be, yeah, George, but Mosler and Kelton, they've changed their tune. They understand that the system has changed. They were just describing it prior to 2008. And that's fine. But if now they describe it the way everyone else describes it, like Brent Johnson, Luke Groman, Lynn Alden, and myself, they really don't have a theory. They're part of the consensus view. Really, the only thing that makes them unique is how they see inflation. You continue to print enough money to buy whatever you want in the real economy. You spend that money into existence, whether it's through UBI, infrastructure spending, a Green New Deal. And if expectations for inflation rise, if we start to see the 1970s coming, the only thing you have to do is increase taxes and it's problem solved. But like so many things in economics, it works really well on paper, but when you put it into real life with actual human beings, not so much. And to illustrate my point, we'll go to a chart going back to 1930 to 2010. This is a chart of tax revenue received by the government as a percentage of GDP. On the left, it goes from 0% up to 100%. The blue line represents the highest marginal tax rate at any given time. So back here around World War II is almost at 100%. Just think about how much that would motivate you to actually go to work. Wow. But during the 1980s, it was around 28%. So dramatic fluctuations. But look what happens to the amount of tax revenue actually collected as a percentage of GDP. It goes up to a point in the mid-1940s, and then it pretty much flatlines and averages out to about 18%, regardless of how high taxes are. And there's a variety of reasons why this plays out in the real world. But the main reason is that rich people just won't pay the taxes. You can only increase it so high before they start moving it overseas or do something to where they're not going to pay it. You can not like it, you can get pissed off about it, but it is what it is. So if the MMT troll guy was in charge and he saw inflation expectations rising like the 1970s, he would increase taxes, but no more taxes would come into the government. In other words, in their terms, no additional money would be destroyed. Therefore, inflation would get worse and worse and worse. There would be no way to combat it whatsoever. And let's think this through another way. Your options are to increase taxes on the 99% or the 1%. Obviously, it's going to be far more politically palatable to increase the taxes on the 1%. But if you do that, they're not going to pay it, most likely. Okay, well, now we could just go ahead and increase corporate tax rates. Those should be way higher anyway. That's fine, but if you increase corporate taxes, you're most likely lowering the share price. And we know that our economy is built on asset bubbles, like a stock market bubble, confidence, and ever-increasing amounts of debt. So if you're increasing corporate tax rates, you're potentially crashing the stock market or bringing it down by 20, 30, 40%, taking it into a bear market. Therefore, you're affecting consumer spending dramatically, and then the whole house of cards comes crashing down. And your friend and family member Fred right about now is saying, yeah, George, I get it, but you're just exaggerating. You're just fear-mongering. That would never happen because the Fed can always just print money to prop up the stock market. We see it right now with the elections. It doesn't matter that Joe Biden might be getting in office and increasing corporate tax rates. The market still goes up because although there's a headwind with additional taxes, there's a big tailwind because the market believes the Fed is just going to do more and more quantitative easing, and the government is just going to spend more and more money through stimulus packages. But if we got inflation, there would be no more Fed put. There'd be no more government put. They couldn't keep printing bank reserves. They couldn't keep spending stimulus money into the economy because that would exacerbate the inflation. So what happens is they paint themselves into a corner where the only thing they can do is sit back and watch the inflation genie wreak havoc on the entire United States economy. So the main takeaways for this video is number one, prepare for MMT. Whether you like it or not, it's going to be a big part of our future. Next is at some point in time through this MMT, they're going to create inflation that'll be far more difficult than they believe to actually control. And lastly, we all need to be cognizant of the fact that MMT models say the way you combat inflation is through higher taxation. And if the higher taxes don't work on the rich, if they don't work on corporate America, there's only one thing left to do. Increase your taxes. The average Joe and Jane, the poor middle class, the 99%. And I think that this is the end game for MMT. Higher inflation and higher taxes. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.